Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, how are you?
Doing okay. I
Glad to,
didn't know I had to register for the conference to get the Zoom link, so I quickly did that at a quarter to.
I
And
don't, I actually don't think that's the problem. I'm frantically emailing people. I'm not sure anyone got the link. So just bear with me a minute. I'm not sure what went wrong, but I'm getting a lot of email from people saying I didn't get it.
so it went
So,
into my junk email. So you should tell them to check their spam or junk email.
oh, okay.
So that was the issue for me. It didn't come to my inbox.
And when did you get it?
I got it probably 2 minutes after registering. So
Okay.
I checked out and I got an immediate link or immediate confirmation of the purchase for $0. And then a few minutes later, I got the link all sent to my spam email. And it just so
Okay.
happens I cleaned out all my junk email the other day, so I could see the number increasing. Otherwise, it may have been overlooked. So that could be a problem for a lot of people as well.
Okay, because their boxes aren't familiar with us. Okay, so I have sent a couple of different emails here to people who have reached out to me, and I've fielded some phone calls. Let me make you co-host while first of all, nice to meet you.
Nice to
Thank
meet
you for
you.
doing this with us.
Not a problem.
Let me,
So what I do for my class is you can go to the participants and invite them and send them the link to direct link to the Zoom meeting. And that way, like if you had a mass email for your group, you just send it out and say, here's the link to the talk. I do that with my students. I'm having a guest speaker tomorrow for one of my classes, and I just send out the Zoom link to the speaker and the students.
and that's what I'm doing. It's just we have a brand new system and I don't know how to download the list. So I'm doing
I
it
see.
kind of one at a time. But
Okay.
let me, which is not good. I'm also trying to figure out how, for some reason, normally I just make you a co-host and I'm not getting that option popping up. Also, we are recording. There we go. Now I'm making you a co-host. Are you okay with us recording this?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just making sure.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you asking.
All right, let me get rolling on sending out emails and admitting people in case we have a combination of both things going on here.
Okay.
I thought I would give you a quick introduction, but if we end up spending all of our time inviting people in, then I may just let you launch.
Yeah, I can introduce myself. Not a problem.
I did want to thank Carolyn, who's here with us, and she was the one who recommended you as a speaker, and I'm very grateful that she did. So I hope to introduce her as well. She may not know that because we haven't talked today. And I hope the name of your talk was okay, or that you can wing it with what I entitled.
I can, yeah. I can tell how long ago the invite was based on the talk title. So that one was did I say yes like last year early on, like in the middle of the pandemic type thing? Or did you pulled that talk title from somewhere?
I just pulled it from your.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not a problem. I added something to it. And I was going to start off by talking a little bit about the edition, but yeah, it'll work. I think people will get the point early on in the talk.
I figured you probably are fairly comfortable with improvising.
Yes, I can do that.
All right. go. So are your students, are you in full swing with a new group of students right now?
Yeah, the semester, we're coming up to our spring break, so I guess that's halfway through.
Yeah,
And then I have my grad students that
are on a whole different.
they're in the middle of things, yeah, in a different way. So
Now, I wasn't clear if your grad students were at WPI and your undergrads are at UMass Dartmouth, or is it?
so I have three grad students at Dartmouth, and then there's one that decided to stay at WPI that's co-advised, and they're doing more modeling work, the field work, and all of the direct hands-on bee experiments in the lab and the field work. All those students are with me at Dartmouth. And that student at WPI will graduate hopefully by the end of the summer, and then everybody will just stay at Dartmouth and then go to WPI if they need to learn about modeling.
Sounds like a great partnership.
Yeah, we've been working with high schools, and we just put in a grant to work with middle schools to bring that Bee-Ecology project and the computer science that's associated with it together into the curriculum. So we've had some good success at the high school level, and so we're doing the same at the middle school level. CS for All is the name of the program. So it's trying to increase CS, improve attitudes and bring CS into or help CS to reach a wider range of student. And so our idea is that we're going to bring it into the STEM disciplines, and we're using the plant pollinator systems and the computer science that we've developed around that to try to help teach computer science in STEM. So
Okay.
we're going to train teachers how to integrate those two things together, focused on a real world problem in whatever discipline they're in. So if they like chemistry or they like biology, we can help them to develop curriculum in that way. So
it's a good case study model.
Yeah, it's citizen science. So yeah, active learning, participation, problem-based learning, that type of thing. So
how many?
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Where are your schools? Are they primarily?
So we have partnered with Dartmouth, Worcester, Quabbin, and so Nipmuc is in there as well, Fall River, and there's one other in there. There's one other in there somewhere. Maybe that's it for the middle school. The high school teachers there are a few other schools in there, and there's Framingham is one, and there's one other.
So you're kind of spread out around the area.
Yes, we tried to get teachers from different areas representing different student populations, and we did get that for the first round, and now we're working more with the districts to try to develop this research partnership. That's a part of the grant. So anyway,
all right, so
it's good. It funds my research, so I continue to do my research, and then the results and the research and the citizen science part of it gets brought in. So it's good for me because it's helping my research, even though it's more education focused, which I'm interested in as well, but it's not like I'm.
Right, that wasn't what you started out trying to.
No, it was that interest and then seeing that it could be used in that context and get us some funding, which is hard to get, that that helped. So. Oh, we have some others joining, so your links are being received, and
Well,
that's good.
I hope so. I don't know how many of them. So those of you joining us, if you could let me know in the chat if you found where you found your link, and if you just got it just now, or my name is Susan Thomas, and I am the district administrator for the Middlesex Conservation District. And we are so grateful to have you here tonight and to have Dr. Gegear here to talk to us about pollinators and our gardens and how we can work together to make sure that we are all well nourished and that our habitats are native and working well to support us and all the life that we have in our landscape. So I am just trying to figure out why we're a little low on attendance and whether or not folks are finding their links. Our links went out the first day when you ordered and may have ended up in your junk file. So I have been sending out emails frantically one at a time to you guys. So I'm not seeing more people enter. I think what I'm going to ask that you do, Dr. Gegear, is that you just get started and I will keep sending out emails. I don't want to hold us up too long for the people who are here. Unless, how long I had planned on 2 hours, so. You're muted.
Sorry, you're right. Yeah, so I was thinking, 45 to an hour talk, but I can easily extend that. But, we don't have to start right away. If you wanted to wait a few minutes, I'm fine waiting if others are okay waiting.
It sounds like we have time to wait. So hang in there with us for a little bit and let me see if I can send out more emails, because we were expecting a good 25 people. So we're a little low here. So if you're just joining us, thank you for coming. I'm Sue Thomas, the Middlesex Conservation District Administrator. We're thrilled to have Dr. Gegear here. It seems a lot of folks are having trouble finding their links. So I am just trying to resend those quickly to people since we are a little low on attendance yet. So we'll wait a few more minutes before getting started. We will be recording, so if you come in a little late, you don't need to worry about that. Carolyn, do you want to spend a few minutes talking about the plant sale? Introduce yourself as our wonderful new plant sale coordinator and talk maybe about how you derived our selection this year.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Dr. Gegear.
Hello, how are you?
Hi, Lisa. I'm good. So I'm in charge of organizing the Conservation District plant sale this year, and I derived all of our selections from your plant list, Rob, which was, really something that I used as the basis for all of my buying. We had a few I'll say more than a few problems with suppliers. So I was really hoping to order a lot of things from the women at Blue Stem Natives, but their property had some problems during the November nor'easter. And they
Yeah.
were hoping to build a greenhouse, which they didn't, so they couldn't supply us. So
Mhm.
I found a grower in New Jersey who pretty much had a large spectrum of what you recommend. So that's
Oh, good.
yeah.
Maybe you can give me their name. Because I know there's Wing and a Prayer Nursery. It's in Western Mass. It's really good. But is a bit of I don't think they send send plants, like you have to go pick them up. And then there's Northeast Pollinator Plants that is good for a lot of them, and they will ship to you, which is convenient, and the plants are in good shape. I've been ordering from them for the past couple of years.
Oh, good. Yeah. This is Neil Barger at Full Moon. Kind
Full
of in
Moon, okay.
central New Jersey.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he gardens for appearance and also, a full season of native bloom. So,
Mhm.
He's a wholesaler. We can get the appropriate size plants at the appropriate price. So that
Great.
was something that was really,
And do they ship them to you?
they do, they ship. So nobody has to drive to,
Yeah,
know,
I'm going to
mid-New
write
Jersey.
that down.
Yeah, I can send it to you.
I'll text myself while we're waiting here.
Yeah, and again, the guy's name is Neil. Barger is his last name, but he seems to be the main sales contact there. So he's sending us flats of things like Pennsylvania sedge and Prunella vulgaris that were hard for me to find elsewhere.
Mhm.
I investigated another native plant grower in northern Middlesex County that had an invasion of Asian jumping worms. So he
Oh,
said,
yeah.
Better not, please don't order from me, So that was sad. But have you ever run into that?
I just this past year, I started
Yeah.
to see more and more. So there has been, I would say, an explosion. And I've had a lot of people telling me that they've been seeing them like last fall in particular, or late summer, they were seeing quite a few. So yeah, it seems that they're becoming a big problem.
Yeah, since Lisa Heffley's here, Lisa, have you ever seen them actually in the bee meadow or in your vast gardening experience?
I just became aware of them last year, and since I was doing completely invasion work last year, I think I saw them in the upper meadow, and promptly killed them. But yeah, it's new. They're new in my awareness.
They're relatively new for a lot of people. We're still trying to figure out what to do. Squishing them is, from what I hear, pretty much the best thing you can do. They're hard to eliminate once they're entrenched.
Yeah, I think if you're doing organic gardening, the best thing you can do is like incinerate the top 4 inches of topsoil and start again. It's one of those things like Creeping Charlie that you have a really hard time getting, getting ahead of, but I don't know, we'll see. Maybe we'll find something that will gobble them up.
Or promote fishing.
Yeah, that's right.
Fish don't eat them. I know people who said, wow, cool, night crawlers, all right, but I guess the fish around here don't really like them, so.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I know. So again, I fall back on, domestic pets, people who have reptiles, as I used to do. It's kind of like, well, they're not that picky and they eat things that move. So I don't know. I just don't know. It sounds like just another new invasive Holocaust.
Yeah, add it to the list.
I know.
Well, I'm not seeing anyone else trying to come in here. So I think it's 7:15. We should probably get going. Once again, my name is Sue Thomas. I'm the district administrator for the Middlesex Conservation District. This is our first time registering folks through our new ordering system. And we're glad that you were able to find us. We're excited to welcome Dr. Gegear with us, and we hope that you're ready to hear more about how your plants can help the pollinators and your habitats to grow. Thank you everyone for coming.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I am not sure if it was mentioned, but I'm at faculty at UMass Dartmouth, and I've been studying ecology, evolution, and conservation of plant pollinator systems for over 30 years now. So I've been at this a while. Today I'm going to talk about, so the title of my talk, it's interesting. I was saying this earlier, that I can tell when I accepted a talk invitation based on the title, and this is one of my older titles, so I guess it was pulled from somewhere. But the People-Plant-Pollinator-Solution, or connection, was the title, and I added wildlife because I find that whenever the term pollinator is used, people immediately think of bees, particular honeybees. And the problem that we're facing globally really doesn't have much to do with bees. It has to do with pollination and the functional role of bees and other flower visiting animals as pollinators. So I threw wildlife in here to try to show that I'm talking about, or going to focus on, the ecological side of this issue and not agriculture and honeybees. But I'll talk about those differences and what is the problem and how did I think we should solve it, and then looking at some solutions and end with some success stories. So on a high note, but to start, I feel that, as I mentioned, when I say pollinator, people immediately think of honeybee, but I get a sense that the term pollinator is used to the point where people are not using it correctly, and missing the point, missing the importance of the problem, and also are not thinking that they're helping to solve the problem, but actually contributing to the problem. And it all boils down to a lack of understanding about plant pollinator interaction. So I'm going to start by talking about what are called pollination systems. So I call it Pollination Biology 101, give you a crash course in that. Once we get an understanding of what these systems are and what they are not, then we're going to shift into talking about the problem, which is the degradation of these systems globally. Shifting our focus more to Massachusetts, what's going on here. talk about the Bee-Ecology project, which is the way that a way that you can help me to not only figure out what's going on, but also you know, I've shifted things a little bit. The Bee-Ecology project includes helping with the solution, and so taking conservation action. And I'll finish with talking about some of the work we're doing, or I'm doing, across the state, and some of the successes we've had already. So starting off, you know, as I said, we're starting off with a very basic question, and that is, what is a pollinator? And if I was giving this talk in person, and a lot of the workshops that I give, I start off by asking the audience, what is a pollinator? And I get a wide variety of answers that have elements of the definition, but I have yet to get somebody give me the full proper definition of a pollinator. And so, you know, what's the difference between a flower visitor and a pollinator? It seems trivial, but it's an extremely important point, and one that I'll carry through the talk. So a wide variety of animals visit flowers to feed on the nectar or pollen, both. Globally, there are about 200,000 of these species, the vast majority of which are insects. So of the 200,000 species out there, globally, there are about 1,000 are vertebrates, like the hummingbird shown over here. The insects, you know, it's you know, every insect type is visiting flowers. So we've got, you know, wide variety of bees, we've got moths and butterflies, we've got flies and beetles and wasps, all visiting flowers to collect or feed on the nectar or pollen, or both. So these animals, as the environment that they encounter, shown here in the background, there's a lot in bloom at the same time. And so these animals have evolved mechanisms to help them to figure out which flowers have nectar and pollen, and which ones don't, and also those that do have nectar or pollen, which ones offer the highest quality nectar and pollen. And you can imagine, and those of you that have a garden, or you know, you've walked through a field with your tick spray on, you know, that you see a lot of activity. All these animals are competing for nectar and pollen, so it's a limited resource. They deplete it from the flower, and the flower will replenish the nectar to some degree, but there's a lot of competition going on. And so how do they figure out which ones have good nectar and pollen? There's widely held view that they're innately attracted to certain colors and certain odors, and it turns out that that's not the case. So it's a very popular misconception out there that if we put in flowers of a certain color, we're attracting butterflies. If we put in another color, we're attracting bees or hummingbirds. In fact, what's going on is that these animals are learning which ones have, you know, offer a good reward and which ones they should avoid. The way we know this is we bring these animals into the lab and we test them. We present them with different colors and odors, and we see if that elicits a feeding response. So in the case of the monarch butterfly, if you touch their legs with a cotton swab soaked in sucrose solution, they stick out their tongue like Pavlov's and his dogs, and they'll ingest the nectar or the sugar solution. You show them a color. So I showed them yellow. I didn't see any feeding response until I touched the legs with the sucrose solution. Once I do that, the animal is forming, the butterfly is forming an association between the color and reward. The way we know that is we present it with other colors. So here there's no innate feeding response where we see the butterfly looking for food. So there's no innate preference for blue. Here we show a color similar to the test color, orange. We don't see a response. And then we show that the color that we train the butterfly to, and we very quickly see a feeding response from the butterfly. So we can do this in a wide variety of animals. I've done it in bees and even flies, and we don't see these innate feeding response. So most of what's going on, despite the fact that this butterfly has a brain the size of a pinhead, it's able to remember those associations after a couple of pairings. It can remember them for up to 2 months. In the case of migrants that live much longer than the summer butterflies. And these butterflies can remember colors, odors, combinations of colors and odors and shapes. So they've got fairly sophisticated learning and memory abilities, and they use these abilities to give them the edge when it comes to exploiting flora resources. They also have other, they also have morphological features like a long tongue that helps them to exploit nectar from tubular flowers. And so while they're doing this, though, the plants are not passive in this process. They're actually very active. And so when we look at what's going on from the plant's perspective, if our flower visitor is visiting, collecting nectar or pollen from the flower, and in the process is transferring the pollen, right? So most people get, when I say what's a pollinator, they say, oh, it's an animal that transfers pollen. Well, that's part of it, but the animal needs to transfer pollen that leads to fertilization and the production of seeds and fruit. So flowering plants, there are about 300,000 flowering plant species globally. Some of those reproduce using the wind. So the pollen, which is the male, you can think of it as the male gametes, need to be deposited on the surface of the stigma, which is the female reproductive organ. And so how is it that the plant's able to achieve this when plants can't run around and find a mate? So some of them use the wind to transfer their pollen, some of them use water. This is a fairly inefficient system. So you can imagine that if I want to, my mate is downwind, or sorry, upwind, and I release my pollen, it's all going to be blown downwind. So it's not a very efficient way to transfer pollen, similar with water, upstream, downstream, that type of thing. So of those 300,000 or so flowering plant species, the vast majority of them are animal pollinated because that helps them to target their pollen transfer to some degree. Now, if the animal does transfer that pollen, leading to the fertilization, the production of seeds and fruit, then and only then can we call that animal a pollinator. If it transfer pollen but doesn't lead to that, it's simply a flower visitor. And this distinction is extremely important. From the plant's perspective, so we could have an animal that's moving up this inflorescence, transferring pollen from flower to flower, but if this plant is self-incompatible, which means it can't receive its own pollen, or its own pollen doesn't lead to fertilization and the production of seeds and fruit, then we have an animal transferring pollen, but it's simply a flower visitor. If the animal then takes the pollen from this plant and deposits it over here on an unrelated plant, and it leads to fertilization and production of seeds and fruit, then it is a pollinator. And we can only call it a pollinator until it completes that process of pollination, and this is called outcrossing. So some plants are self-incompatible, meaning that they need their pollen transferred. Some are self-compatible, but when they get their own pollen, they don't produce as many seeds as they would if it was outcrossed, so there's a benefit to being outcrossed. And so, it depends on the plant species, and plants have evolved a wide variety of strategies. Some plants have the male and female parts on the same flower. Some have it on the same plant, but the different parts of the plant. So at the bottom of the inflorescence versus the top. Some of them have male and females on the same plant coming out at different times. Some have male and female plants. And so I give you a whole talk on the plant side and plant mating systems. But the take home here is that we need to understand what the consequence of the animal visiting the plant is. Does it lead to this fertilization or not, in order to call it a pollinator? And most people see things on a flower and they assume that it is a pollinator. To put this in perspective, here's, I think this was used to advertise my talk. This is an obedient plant. On the right up here, we have Bombus fervidus and Bombus affinis. Both of these species are currently in decline. This one is the first bumblebee on the endangered species list, and this one is still around. So this one's locally, well, I have hope that it's still in Massachusetts, but thought to be locally extinct. This one's still around, but in low number. So our Bombus fervidus is going into the flower to get the nectar, which is located at the base of the flower down here. And in doing so, it's making contact with the male and female parts, transferring pollen, and in the process, fertilizing and leading to the production of seeds and fruit. So our Bombus fervidus is a pollinator of this plant. Our Bombus affinis, instead of going in the flower, it's got a short tongue, right? Our Bombus fervidus has a long tongue. Bombus affinis is biting base of the flower and stealing the nectar. And in doing so, it's not making any contact with male and female reproductive organs. So here, our Bombus affinis is a flower visitor. And in fact, we could call our Bombus affinis a parasite because it's taking nectar from this plant and not giving the plant anything in return. So it's benefiting by feeding on the nectar, but not giving the plant anything in return, unlike our Bombus fervidus. And in addition, our Bombus affinis, by taking the nectar, is depleting the flower of nectar. So when our Bombus fervidus comes in, it doesn't get any nectar and it's going to start to avoid obedient plant. So it's actually conferring a cost to the plant. So I could have thousands of Bombus affinis in this system, and not one of them would be a pollinator. And I couldn't call my Bombus affinis a pollinator until I introduced a plant that it actually does pollinate. Similarly, I could feed my, let's say I could invent a feeder. I could feed all the bees in the world, right, on this single feeder. We put them out. Thousands of Bombus affinis, thousands of Bombus fervidus, but they still would not be considered pollinators because I don't have the obedient plant for them to pollinate. So we can't call something an animal a pollinator, hoping that it's going to pollinate something in the future. We have to make sure that the plants are there, that it actually pollinates. And this, for whatever reason, is the point that most people miss. They love to use the term pollinator, but there are no plants. The plant diversity is minimal, and they're basically feeding the animals and keeping them going. But they're not introducing the plants that they pollinate so that we can get the benefits of the pollination. We're going to see what those benefits are in a minute. To put things in, to give you another example of this and how things can go, this is the pineland golden trumpet. And here we have a table of all the bees and butterflies that were observed feeding on this pineland golden trumpet. Only 3 of them, so there are a dozen or so here, only 3 of them are actually transferring pollen and acting as pollinators in this system. So if I remove all 3 of these, I would still have 9 species, tons of activity on this pineland golden trumpet. None of them are pollinating. None of them are pollinators. They're all flower visitors. The plant is not benefiting from all of those bees all over this plant. Similarly, I could get rid of those 9 and keep the 3, or even keep one of the 3, and I would have pollinators and that plant would be benefiting. And everything that uses that plant, that pollinated plant, right? So think about the seeds and fruit that are produced and who might use those. All of those are benefiting as well. So hopefully you can see the difference between the pollinator and flower visitor and why it's important. From the plant's perspective, it's all about reproduction. And unless that animal that's visiting is helping in reproduction, it's not doing, its functional role is not there. Its importance is lost. Certainly these animals are important on their own. You know, Bombus affinis is the poster child for pollinator decline, and it's not a good pollinator of tubular flowers because it's evolved a way to cheat the system. But in Bombus affinis on its own is certainly important, but when it's a pollinator and actually pollinating something, it's more important because it's helping that other species. It's helping that plant species to survive and reproduce. So, and persist. So you know, that's why I go on and on about the difference between flower visitors and pollinators. So this brings up what I hear a lot of, and that's, oh, this is a pollinator magnet. This is pollinator friendly plant, or you know, this, I'm going to create pollinator habitat. And really, more often than not, what's happening is we're feeding animals rather than you know, restoring pollination in these systems. And so, you know, another example, we love our hummingbird feeders, which is, you know, fine. Our hummingbirds, we're feeding, you know, dozens of hummingbirds, single feeder. And, you know, if I had a bunch of hummingbird pollinated plants, like we've got lobelia here, we've got monarda, and we've got jewelweed and patience capensis, and we've got our hummingbird that's coming in and seeing a feeder versus, you know, these flowers. Hummingbirds aren't stupid. They're going to go and they're going to, they could get an unlimited amount of nectar in one hand and then go and hide from predators, or they have to visit hundreds of flowers. It takes a lot more work to get fed when you're visiting flowers. So of course they're going to go over here. And so going over here, we're certainly helping the hummingbirds, but these plants are not getting pollinated, so we're not helping them. And everything that might use these plants or feed on the seeds, for example, let's say this is a self-incompatible plant, so it can't produce its own seeds without the help of an animal, and its pollinators over here, then it's not pollinated. This isn't pollinator friendly. Similarly, if I put in European honeysuckle, a non-native plant that's pulling, let's say it has more nectar, so I'm pulling the pollinators from the native species, and I'm pollinating here, but the products of pollination, birds don't want to eat the seeds, I'm losing that functional importance. So it matters that it's all about, actually, it's not about the animal, it's about the native plant. At the very least, it's about the connection between that animal and that plant. That's what we're focused on, because that functional importance, that ecological importance is what it's all about, not just keeping those animals happy. If they can't do their job, then we're missing the point. So if we look at animal pollinated plants, so I mentioned there are 300,000 flowering plants, animal pollinated flowering plant species, most of which are animal pollinated. We've got 200,000 species that visit flowers for nectar and pollen and act as a pollinator of something, right? If we look at these systems more closely, what we see is that there isn't a single animal on this side that can pollinate everything over here, and there isn't a single plant species on this side that can feed everything over here. What we see are subsets of plants with flowers that are pollinated by certain types of animal. And so what we call a plant and all of its pollinators, collectively, we call that a pollination system. And I'm perfectly fine with the use of the term pollinator, but because it's more often than not used incorrectly, then I use pollination system because that forces people to think about the plant. The plant, and in particular the native plants, are important because they're the things that are getting pollinated and connecting the animal pollinators to wildlife, right? And we'll see that in a second. If we look at these pollination systems, there are certain pollination systems correspond to certain types of animals for the most part. So here we have a plant species pollinated by a bumblebee. We can see the pollen on the thorax or the back of this bumblebee. Here are the stamens. So the bees going in to get the nectar inside this tube, at the base of this tube, and the plants depositing the pollen here. Why? Because it's very hard for this bee to groom the pollen off. Bees want to collect pollen and take it back to their nest to feed their young. Now, if they're taking all the plant's pollen, the plant doesn't have much to reproduce. So plants have evolved tricks to put the pollen in places that it's difficult for the animal to get rid of it, right? Or to groom it off. So most of it is transferred to the flower of another individual of the same species. Here we have a hummingbird. Notice the pollen is deposited on the forehead of the hummingbird. Why? Because if the pollen was deposited on the wing, it would be a very inefficient system. The stigma is located up here. So as this bird moves to get the nectar, which is located at the base of the tube, it slides into position and the pollen on the forehead rubs up and gets attached to the female reproductive organ, leading to fertilization seed set. Here we have a more specialized system. We have a fly. The nectar is located down here at the bottom of the slide. There's a long tube, and this fly's tongue goes to about here. So this plant is pollinated by this fly species alone, and this fly feeds only on the nectar of this plant species. And so if we lose the plant species, we lose the fly. If we lose the fly, we lose the plant species. This is the pollen here that's attached to the tongue of the fly. Very difficult for the fly to remove that. Here we have a monarch butterfly. We see the pollen on the proboscis here. So as it's probing around into these different flowers, it's transferring the pollen as it goes from flower to flower, and then will fly to another plant. Now, these systems certainly can support other insects. So our bumblebee could crawl in here to get the nectar, But again, that's a cost to the plant. So what have plants done? They've evolved mechanisms to deter bumblebees. So the reason that these hummingbird flowers are red is not because of an innate attraction, that hummingbirds are innately attracted to the color red. That's not true. They're learning to associate red with reward. What this red functions, the way that this red functions is to deter bumblebees. It's very difficult for bumblebees to learn associations between red and a particular flower orientation or smell. And so they'll avoid these flowers when there are other flowers present because they can't extract nectar as efficiently. So a lot of complicated things, a lot of really cool mechanisms from the plant side to keep their good pollinators, track their good pollinators, and deter the ones that don't pollinate or are less efficient. So if we look at pollination systems, right, there are two types of pollination systems. Right? Remember, it's the plant and everything that pollinates it. Two contexts where these systems are important, and the one that you're likely most familiar with is agriculture. Right? In these systems, on the animal side, most of the pollinators, where the animals that are doing the work, the pollinating, are honeybees. Why? Because this is what needs to be pollinated, right? We've got acres and acres of one thing that's in bloom for a couple of weeks, and we need to get thousands of individuals out to do the pollinating. So each one of these honeybee hives is, 30,000 individuals. And so we bring our truck in, or we keep our honeybees and let them go, and they can do the job. They do a great job pollinating a lot of one thing. They evolved in Africa, where trees were in bloom for short periods of time. And so they needed to get everybody from the hive to go to a single location, get all the nectar and stockpile it. And we've exploited that behavior, that behavioral tendency. So they've been domesticated for about 3,000 years and shipped around the globe. So they're non-native species, but they're very good at what they do, and that is pollinating a lot of one thing. We have a handful of native species. So here's bumblebee that buzz pollinate. So they're good for some things, and we have a few other native species. But if I mentioned there are 200,000 species that could function as a pollinator worldwide. There are like 4,000 bee species in North America alone. Only about 5% of, and there are also thousands of butterflies and other things. Only about 5% of them are visiting crop plants. So the vast majority of what we see out on our plants are not important when it comes to crop pollination. And this has important implications for conservation, right? If we want to save the honeybee, or we want to save something to help us with crop pollination, it's got to be something that's really abundant at the time of year that we need to pollinate crop plants. A lot of things don't come out till later. A lot of things are in low number, and they're going to be overlooked, and they are overlooked in conservation and agricultural context. So we've got a handful of pollinators pollinating a handful of plants that aren't native. They may have had native ancestors, but we've selectively bred them to do different things. And that's feeding one species, that's us. And we could throw in domesticated animals for argument's sake. So, a handful of species. Important species. So all of this is extremely important, but it isn't the whole story, right? If we look now at the ecological side, the ecological importance of pollination, the game changes completely. Here, what matters is the diversity of those pollination systems. All of those systems, all of those plants pollinated by different animals are supplying different types of food to different animals. So you can imagine that we've got seeds and fruit produced. We've got plant material can be used as shelter or nesting sites for birds and small mammals at this trophic level, right? And these animals are food for predatory species. And so as we can think of our pollination systems, and specifically the diversity of pollination system, right? So what matters here is how many of these systems we have. By the way, honeybees don't play any role from an ecological perspective because they haven't co-evolved with any flowering plants here, any native flowering plants. No plants depend on honeybees for pollination. And so they are exploiting nectar and pollen, taking nectar and pollen from these plants, and pollen nectar is a limited resource. And so there we have competition. And so, competition between honeybees and native bees isn't necessarily a good thing. And so we have all of these connections, diversity of connections here supporting our the health and the functioning of our whole ecosystem, all this ecological network. And so as we start to remove, if we start to remove these systems, we're going to compromise less food here. So we're going to start to compromise these other trophic levels. And eventually we'll get to a point where we've removed enough of our foundation that we're going to get what's called ecosystem collapse. And so, from the agricultural perspective, it's all about dollars, right? How much are we going to lose if we don't have pollinators? We need 1 out of 3 bites of food we take, which is all true. And so people, I don't think, have appreciated the importance of what's going on the ecological side, because there doesn't seem to be a dollar value associated with it. There's no clear, first of all, we don't know when something is in bad shape because there's so much complexity. There's so much going on in terms of species connections. And so we don't appreciate an intact system or understand an intact system, and we won't understand it until it's gone, until we get ecosystem collapse. And so to look at these connections more closely, right here, I've got one example, and this is leading into what I'm trying to do. We've got Carolina, Virginia rose, so our native roses, they're supplying pollen to bees. The vast majority of bees need pollen to make new bees, and this is a great source of pollen for a lot of bees. It also is a host plant for the apple sphinx moth, and the larvae of the apple sphinx moth are eaten by a wide variety of birds. They love to feed on butterfly larvae, moth larvae. The adults, apple sphinx moth, are fed by other bird species that are also at risk. So everything is connected, right? But this is what I mean by pollination products. If this plant is self-incompatible, meaning that there's no seeds and fruit produced if we don't have bees, and it doesn't have its pollinator in the area, we're losing all of these connections in the system, and we're going to start to see our whippoorwills going down because there aren't enough apple sphinx moths, because we don't have enough pollination of Carolina and Virginia rose to keep that species at the levels it needs to be to get enough sphinx moths to feed our eastern whippoorwills, that type of thing. So collectively then, why should we care about ecosystem collapse? Obviously, biodiversity is we assume in conservation biology that biodiversity is a good thing. And up until fairly recently, we didn't realize or appreciate why it's a good thing. Like, we just had to believe it was a good thing. And then people started to recognize that these functional and diverse ecosystems are providing us with things called ecosystem services. These are things we get from nature for free. And here's a list of everything we get through healthy and diverse ecosystems, right? So if we start to erode these systems, we start to lose these services, we're going to get to a point where with ecosystem collapse, where we lose these services. And I'll tell you that, if we would then need to invent a way to replace the services, carbon sequestration, water purification, all of these things come from healthy ecosystems. We would have to figure out a way to replace them. And in many cases, I don't think we could replace them. And if we could, there's going to be a significant price tag associated with it. So there's definitely an economic cost associated with the loss of these pollination systems and the loss of diversity in ecosystems. But hopefully people will start to pay more attention until it's too late, because as they say, extinction is forever, and we won't get these things back. All right. So hopefully you have a sense of what a pollinator is, a pollination system, why they're important, and the difference between pollination in agriculture with honeybees and pollination in an ecological context with these systems, these native plant pollinator co-evolved systems, and the important role that they play. So the problem is that these systems are degrading globally. And so, just looking at New England for a second, bumblebees, which are the black and yellow fuzzy ones, the Bombus impatiens and Aphanus that I showed you earlier, bumblebees that were both historically present in Massachusetts. And so here's some data. I went and pulled historical records and then went back to those same areas where they did collecting, in the 70s and 80s, and resurveyed from 2015 to the present. And this is showing you some data from, I think this is Terricola, it would be, I think this is high elevation data. Anyway, so pre-2000s blue bars, current is yellow, and you can see in many cases the yellow bars are lower than the blue bars. In the case of Bombus affinis, there are no yellow bars because you didn't find Pennsylvanicus affinis. These things, a lot of these species, Terricola, vagans, are all in decline. The same thing's going on with the butterflies. So here's the anything below this line is decreasing species-wise. Anything, everything below the line is decreasing. The same thing's going on with our native plants. The one thing that I want to point out here, because I'm sure everybody is aware that things are in trouble and declining, what a lot of people don't realize is that there are many, many species that are actually increasing in abundance and entering or spreading out in terms of their geographic distribution. So here we see the yellow bars are much higher than the blue bars. For these two species, Bombus impatiens is a bumblebee that you'll see in the thousands in an area. So it'll be, your plants will be covered with bees, late August, and it's all Bombus impatiens, where there should be 5 or 6 other species there in addition to Bombus impatiens. So that's a sign that your area is in trouble and needs help. It's the same with the butterflies, and it's the same, not surprisingly, with the native plants. So the species of native plant like Penstemon hirsutus that's in decline, not surprisingly, is pollinated by these long-tongued bees that are also in decline. We're seeing parallel declines. And so those entire systems are being degraded and potentially lost. And so we need to fix that. But these differential declines factor into things. The other thing that I've noticed is that people equate specialist with threatened species. And so there's a big difference between a specialist, a rare species, and a declining species. And so to give you an example, right, here we have the goldenrod cellophane bee. It's a goldenrod specialist. Now, this bee, assuming it has nesting habitat, goldenrod is not in short supply in Massachusetts. So although this bee only eats goldenrod nectar and pollen, it's not in any trouble. In fact, it's probably increasing in number because goldenrod is everywhere and expanding. So that's a specialist. Bombus sandersoni is a rare bumblebee species. Historically, it was rare, and currently it is rare, but it is not in decline, right? It's just, it's found in certain areas. It's not widely distributed, and so it's considered rare. Bombus terricola was one of the most abundant species in the state, was all over the Cape and the islands in the 80s, and now can't be found anywhere east of Springfield. So that species is clearly declining. It's what was once abundant is now not abundant and head in the direction of local extinction. That's the focus. The focus is on these declining species. The rare species that are stable, or specialists that specialize on things that are abundant, if the plant species is in trouble, then that specialist bee is in trouble, right? So we need to, again, to think about the system and understand what these species, how they're responding to human disturbance over time. Some species aren't responding at all. They're just maintaining status quo. Others are increasing and some are declining. So we really need to focus on, in conservation, we want to focus on things that are in trouble because they're headed in the direction of local extinction. Certainly we want to try to anticipate things that may be in trouble, but we need to separate these three things in order to develop effective conservation strategies. So what's causing the problem? There are a number of factors that are thought to contribute to the degradation of these systems. Pesticides, whether it's neonics, have received a lot of attention and definitely have a negative effect on bees and other flower visiting insects. Herbicides, we're spraying to try to get rid of invasives, which are a problem, but in doing so, we're getting rid of all of our native plant diversity. Climate change is a big one. Disease. So my lab has studied all of these factors. what I want to point out here, so I'm going to focus on this habitat loss and habitat change and to some degree exotic species. But I just want to say that, disease, either new diseases or, there's good evidence that there are diseases moving from honeybees to wild bees, to bumblebees. And so we're getting this, what's called pathogen spillover from one species to another. And pesticides, these issues are more prominent in agricultural and urban areas, right? But these, sorry, I got to hide the meeting controls here. But we knew that things were in decline well before spillover from honeybees and neonics were on the scene, right? Bombus saphenous started decline in the late 90s, and by the early 2000s was gone in a lot of its range. And this is well before the use of pesticides in those areas. So pesticides and disease are likely to amplify effects that were already there. They're speeding up decline in areas, and likely multiple factors are contributing to decline, but underlying everything is going to be some sort of habitat change. And it may be caused by climate change that's changing the habitat in a way that's having a negative effect, or exotic species, but that's likely, and I think most would agree that that's the major driving factor. The problem is it's very difficult to figure out what we've changed and how it's having an effect. And so that's where a lot of my research is focused, and that's where I need your help as citizen scientists to help me figure this out, because as we'll see, it's a very complicated problem and we need a lot of data that we don't have. And I think the first thing that we need to think about is, I mentioned to you that the difference between specialist and stable, but rare and declining species. What we really need to do is to figure out what the species in decline actually need to survive and reproduce. It's all about those species. And each species has a unique set of needs to help it, a unique set of things to help it to survive and reproduce, to complete its life cycle. So in the case of butterflies in general, butterflies need host plants and they need nectar plants. And they don't just need nectar plants anytime. Each species needs nectar plants at a different time because the adults fly at different times of the year. So we could have all the host plants or all the nectar plants that, we could fill up our garden with nectar plants, but if we don't have the butterfly's host plant, we're not going to have that butterfly species on site. Similarly, we could have all the host plants, but if we don't have something in bloom that's a good nectar source when the adults are flying around looking for nectar, then we're not going to be able to support that species. So we can't think of butterflies in a general way. We have to think about specific species that we want to help and what do they need. Similarly with bees, all bees have the same general life cycle. At this time of the year, they're all hibernating. They'll come out, they'll look for a nest site. Once they find a nest site, they'll collect, the females will collect pollen, and both will be feeding on nectar. The pollen, they will lay their eggs in the pollen. The larvae eat the pollen, right? So pollen is their major source of protein. They need pollen to make new bees. The nectar is their fuel that keeps them going. They then need to, at the end of their cycle, the males and females find one another, then they need to find a place to overwinter. Right, so the same cycle, but each species is coming out of hibernation at a different time. Each species is looking for different types of nectar and pollen. They want different places to hibernate. So we can't treat bees as the same thing. They are absolutely not the same thing. So what I'm trying to do is to figure out what those species at risk need, the butterflies and bees and moths that are at risk. What specifically do they need to persist? And in the case of butterflies, a lot's known about the host plant, but there's surprisingly little known about their nectar preferences. We see butterflies and we see bees on a lot of different things, but what does each species prefer? Do they have preferences? And we expect that they would, because they're evolving these different mechanisms like morphological features, long tongues, or certain behaviors to get the competitive edge over all the other flower visiting insects out there. And so we think that they're tuned to certain plant species because that gives them the competitive edge. And we're seeing that in bees. And now with recent work by my grad student, we're seeing that in butterflies as well. So once we appreciate that we need to understand the life cycle. The other thing we need to understand is, what are we looking for? What exactly are we trying to help? As I mentioned, in the case of bumblebees, right? So here's generally what the bumblebees look like. This is pollen, got their proboscis, head, thorax, and abdomen. But bumblebees look different, and they also behave very differently and have different preferences and different, like in terms of nesting, overwintering, and foraging. So these two species are in decline. This one is not. So if we see a bunch of bees, bumblebees buzzing around, how do we know that we're helping? So a lot of this is really paying attention to what you see and being able to identify the ones that need help. So in the case of bumblebees, the two that need help are fairly distinctive. This one's all yellow with a black band, and this one is mostly black with a couple of yellow bands versus bombus impatiens. And I give workshops to help people to ID and see these differences. In butterflies, all of these are decreasing. And so we'd want to, if we see these, we'd want to pay attention to what we have. Again, the common species do not need our help. They're doing just fine with whatever, however we're screwing up the environment. These species are thriving under those conditions. The ones that are in decline seriously need help, and we need to be able to figure out who's in decline and who needs help and who doesn't. And so, this identification is an important first step. So if we look at all the bumblebee species, and this is, I can make this PDF available. It's available on my website. Here are all the bumblebee species historically present in Massachusetts. These are the ones in red are the ones in trouble. Those are our targets. You could think of a wanted poster. And so, it's bumblebees are not one thing. And I think, for a lot of people, because honeybees are one species, there are different races of honeybees, and there's certainly other honeybee species in other places that are native to other places. In Asia, there are native honeybee species. Here, they're non-native, and it's one species. And I think people think of bees as one thing. And, it's not like a lot of the pollinator conservation groups are helping, as we'll see in a minute. They treat bumblebees as one thing and say, plant this for bumblebees. And they're completely missing the species that actually need it, because they're treating bumblebees as one thing, even though each species has a unique set of needs. And, the reason that we have so many species is because they have different needs. If they all were looking for the same thing, competition would eliminate them all, everybody but one species, right? So these differences are what are keeping those species persisting. So again, it just surprises me that people don't focus on species traits when those traits are important to keep the diversity that we have. Anyway, so here's an example of the problem, right? This is pollinator.org. I could have pulled a list from Xerces or any number of groups, USDA. And the first thing we notice is this one size fits all approach that I talked about. This is for bumblebees, quote unquote, digger bees, large carpenter bees. And there are, tens to hundreds of species in each of these. And we look down the list and we see that a lot of these species are non-native. So right away, this tells me that they're just put something out there. If you're feeding the bees, you're doing your job. Well, we've completely lost their functional role as pollinators, which I told you is important. The pollination of those native plants is feeding other wildlife by putting out catnip and some of these others. Although we'll see a bunch of bees, they're not doing their job. In addition, the species that need our help are not visiting catnip. They're visiting clover. Interestingly, clover, particularly red clover, which is the clover and cowvetch are the two species keeping Bombus fervidus from becoming locally extinct, aren't even checked here. So we go down the list. Most of these are visited by common species. There are a couple that are visited, like this. Penstemon is great. Penstemon hircitus, Penstemon digitalis will target those species at risk. But here it seems like you pick any of these. Let's say I could pick two of them. Pick any two and you're going to help the bumblebees. And that absolutely is not the case. And I'll show you data to back that up. And you can put the plants in. You can put in catnip and you'll put in, penstemon. And you'll see the difference between those two. You will not have the same things on those two plant species. You want to see even a bigger difference, put in mountain mint and then put in penstemon or monarda. And you'll see a completely different set of bees, where the bees that are at risk will be on the penstemon and monarda, and you won't see them on the mountain mint unless you're in Western Mass. Anyway, the other thing I want to point out here is rose. Rose is an extremely important pollen source, but it isn't separated out in terms of pollen. And I told you that the bees need preferred pollen. They need good pollen sources to make new bees. And so you would think that, if there was an understanding of the importance of rows, that it would be separated out. So this type of thing, we see all the time. So what is it then that they actually like? How do I know when I look at this list that it's off? And it starts with very basic ecology, that we see if we go out and we look at plant pollinator interactions. We see that long-tongued bees tend to prefer and visit tubular flowers. And these tubular flowers, if we look at who their major pollinators are, tend to be long-tongued bees. There's a fit between those two things. So here is a short medium-tongued bee. This is Bombus impatiens, which we'll see all over goldenrod in the fall. You can see it's just walking, poking its tongue in and able to get the nectar, which is easily accessible. So that's why we see hundreds of things on goldenrod, because it's an open, it's very easily, the nectar is easily accessed. Over here, we've got our, our jewelweed. The nectar is located at the base of the spur. This is Bombus fervidus, our long-tongued bumblebee. It sticks in its head and its tongue can wrap around to get the nectar at the base of this tube. Now, our Bombus fervidus, because it has a long tongue, can outcompete short-tongued species on the jewelweed, right? The short-tongued species can't get the nectar because their tongue isn't long enough, no matter how hard they try. Our Bombus fervidus, however, can't compete with these short to medium-tongued species on goldenrod because the tongue gets in the way. So just based on morphology, based on tongue length alone, we could pick flowers that would be best suited for Bombus fervidus and big ants, which are both long-tongued species and both bumblebee species in decline. But we need to appreciate that these differences exist. And so what I did, knowing this, and there are studies that have been published showing that these long-tongued bees tend to prefer this, but I wanted to get good data for local species. And so what I did in 2015 is I decided to go out and survey bumblebee flower interactions. So here are all the study sites where I have data. So there are 3 in Western Mass at high elevation. This one's high elevation as well, Wachusett Meadow. And then we have 4 that are low elevation sites. I have surveyed from many other areas, filling in these gaps. The patterns hold, but this is what I started with, and I have good data. What I did, so this is Breakneck Hill, 40 acres, walk transects, survey all the bumblebee flower interactions, noting the species of bumblebee. Is it a queen worker or male? Is it collecting nectar or pollen? Put in the data, and then I let the bees tell me what they like, right? Looking for patterns. Do I always see a certain species on a bumblebee species on a certain plant species? Even though there are, 10, 20 other plant species in bloom with other bees on them, do we see these patterns? And it turns out, sure enough, we do. So here are observations just for 1 month from one site, right? At this site, there were about 25 plant species in bloom where I observed at least one bumblebee collecting nectar, all right? And so if we look at, there are probably a few hundred observations that go into these data. If we look at each species, so here are the bumblebee species, the ones that are in trouble are in red. We see that even though there was a bumblebee on 25 different plant species, that each species, the vast majority of observations were on just 2 species. In some case, over 50% of the observations were on a single species, like Terricola was all on, over 50% of the observations, 60% of the observations were on milkweed. And we can see these preferences and Perplexus all over milkweed in July at this site. Meanwhile, we look at our long-tongued bees, and not surprisingly, they're on long tubular flowers, right? Red clover and vetch were preferred. But interestingly, we see that vagans, one of the species in trouble, loves prunella, whereas borealis, which also has a long tongue, didn't show this preference for prunella. And so when you look at all sites and all months, so I surveyed from May through October, we see these preferences. And it's not just based on tongue length. Certainly, the long tongue bees are here, and we can see there are clear patterns. Short tongue bees are doing the open flowers, and the long-tongued bees are doing tubular flowers. But within that, there are these species level preferences that, because they have the same tongue length, the same morphology, are likely due to the nectar chemistry. The nectar has something in it that these species prefer. And I'm working with somebody at Cornell to figure out exactly what these chemicals, what these volatiles are in the nectar. When we look at pollen, oh, well, before we get there, sorry, we're going to talk about another source of data, and that is the data that I collected from citizen scientists through my Bee-Ecology project. So early on in my observations, 2015-ish, I noticed these patterns, and I, at the time had one grad student that was focused more on pesticides, and so I was doing all the data collection myself. I noticed some interesting patterns, and I thought, how could I really ramp up my data collection? Because I need to look for these patterns because they're there, and it's going to be important for conservation. And so what I thought was, why don't I try to get citizen scientists involved, because bumblebees are relatively easy to ID on the wing. So I asked them to send me pictures, and I helped workshops, and the pictures were good, but someone suggested that I use videos, because in that way I could go frame by frame and get the bees from different angles to increase the accuracy of the ID, which was a great idea. And then I teamed up with some computer scientists, Liz Ryder and Carolina Ruiz at Worcester Polytechnic Institute, and we developed this app, the Bee-Ecology web app, that you can get and go out and use. So you can take your videos, you can then use the app to upload your video, go frame by frame, ID the bee. We've now teamed up with iNaturalist. So we've got the iNaturalist API, and we're going to be adding butterflies, and they'll help with the plant IDs. That will be launched in the spring. So really ramping up this data collection. That was phase one, and it was a tremendous success, and I'll talk about the data in a second. Now, based on those data, I was then able to add, so that was the main goal, the first goal that I had for the Bee-Ecology project, and it was a success. And so once I had the data and I noticed these patterns, the next part was teaching people how to assess the quality of their habitat. Could be a garden, could be conservation land, to see what they have and what they don't have, and then to start to put some of the plants in based on the data that they collected and that I collected through my research lab to help to protect and to restore these species at risk in different areas. So if we look at the Bee-Ecology data, so this is for July, right? So here are the bumblebee species, Fervidus, Tricola, and Vegans. They're the ones that I circled in red on the previous slide. And if you follow the color, you can see that Fervidus is preferring red clover, Vegans is also preferring red clover, Vegans is on self-heal. And so the patterns that I'm seeing through the Bee-Ecology data were the same as the patterns that I was observing through more intense and rigorous field surveys. And so, I use the Bee-Ecology data to test the patterns that I'm seeing in a limited number of sites. And it turns out that the data hold across, not just for July, but for all months. I'm seeing the same patterns in the Bee-Ecology data that I'm seeing in my research data. So putting all these data together, then, I created this list of plants that are preferred by these species at risk, the bumblebee species at risk. So if you're at above 1,000 feet, you'll see Bombus terricola, Fervidus, and Vegans. You'll see all three. At lower elevations, where we are, Fervidus and Vegans are your main targets for bumblebees. But what I also did was I looked through the literature to identify butterfly species in decline, figured out the host plants of these butterfly species and other bees, what other bees were considered to be in decline, and what are their flight times, are they ground nesting or stem nesting, and put all that information together on my website, which I'll show you at the end of the talk. But this list is based on, at this point, over 20,000, close to 20,000 observations. And so, I'm pretty confident. I keep seeing these patterns over and over again, but the next part of it is to try to take this information and actually put plants in the ground to see if I can change things. So that's where we're heading. Now, just to give you an example, here's my lab, gegearlab.weebly.com. So you can go there and get a list of the butterfly species in decline, considered to be in decline in your area. You can find the host plants and their flight times, and you can find nectar plants for them. But this is for the bumblebee species at risk. Here's a list of plant suggestions. So in the spring, lupin and wood betony are two really good ones. Canada vetch could be thrown in there. From that, we move into penstemon for nectar, penstemon hirsutus, digitalis into monarda. So bergamot, prunella vulgaris is in there. Purple giant hyssop we could put in, and then jewelweed later in the summer to the fall. So that would give us nectar for these species all the way through. And then in the case of pollen, willow is extremely important in the spring, male willow, because it has nectar and pollen, into the native roses, into meadowsweet and St. John's worts. Shrubby St. John's worts is particularly good leading into the meadowsweet. So we don't need a ton of plants. We just need the key plants in areas to support these species. Now, it's not like I'm excluding common species. The common species will visit these plants as well. But these species, the bumblebee species at risk, will not visit many of the species that the common species really, really like. So this is including rather than other lists that would be excluding to a greater degree, and particularly excluding these bumblebee species and other species in decline. All right, so I mentioned to you that the Bee-Ecology, what the data collection, we continue to do the data collection. I mentioned we're expanding the app, but in terms of assessing the habitat quality, right, which is the next thing that I want Bee-Ecologists to be able to do through training, that is when you go into an area, conservation land, your garden, you need to assess what you have, what you don't have, and what are we going to do, right? You certainly could email me and say, here's what I have, what should I do? But a lot of this is figuring out what you already have. And you can go out, and what's interesting is that you may have things, lots of native plant diversity supporting these species that's already there. It's just being suppressed by non-natives. So here's an example. Here's Breakneck Hill, 40 acres. Here's a wet meadow area down here. It's a stream running through, covered with purple loosestrife in 2000, when I arrived, 2015, 16. On the purple loosestrife, tons, thousands and thousands of honeybees and bombus impatiens, the common species, right? A few butterflies, but what I didn't see were any of bombus vagans or bombus fervidus, those long-tongued bees. I would see them on vetch and red clover on site in low numbers. Sometimes I would see one or two vagans for the entire summer, or fervidus for the entire summer. Sometimes I didn't see any fervidus on site. And so I thought, all right, well, let's remove the purple loosestrife, because we've got all of these thousands and thousands of bombus impatiens supported by purple loosestrife. When purple loosestrife goes out of bloom, they're just going to move to other plants and outcompete everything that's there, including these two species. And so remove the purple loosestrife. And 3 years after the loosestrife was removed, sure enough, here's what emerged. All of these native plants, swamp rose, jewelweed, swamp milkweed, steeplebush, and mimulus. And so this is the first year that, and there was a lot of mimulus that was allowed to grow and bloom because we removed the loosestrife. And the first two bees I saw in mimulus, this is bombus vagans, and this is bombus fervidus. So I didn't see these bees for an entire summer sometimes. I saw one of each species on mimulus, and there were multiple of each on the mimulus that was in bloom where the purple loosestrife used to be. So again, putting mimulus in, it certainly would be helpful, but just by removing the loosestrife, because these invasives are suppressing native plants, you're allowing that diversity to express itself, and then you are helping to support these species. The other is that you really want to minimize the non-native pressure. So the plant side of things, but also in terms of honeybees. And the reason, as I mentioned, is nectar and pollen are a limited resource, and honeybees are in the thousands, right? That they do their job in agriculture. They're so good in agriculture because they're in the thousands. Well, what does that mean ecologically speaking? So here's some data from Lincoln, People for Pollinators, which is one of my sites in Lincoln. And this is Monarda officiosa rubra, we think, although it might maybe media. I have to get a plant, some of the idea. But so I did weekly observations. And so the last week of July is in black. And this is Bimaculatus, a common species. Fervidus and vagans are both the target species, the species at risk, which were observed in multiple individuals observed on the Monarda, and Bombus gricicolis. Those 4 species. Now, I also observed a few carpenter bees, and what carpenter bees love to do with tubular flowers like Bombus affinis is they bite holes and rob the nectar. So here is a carpenter bee robbing the nectar. Under normal circumstances, this is fine. There are very few carpenter bees, and at the time there are very few Bombus impatiens. But what there are a lot of are honeybees with really short tongues. And so I didn't see a single honeybee the last week of July or earlier when this was in bloom. It was all long-tongued bees and butterflies, skippers, and a lot of other things. As soon as these enough holes got put into this Monarda, the honeybees the next week, here is the following week. So this is an hour observation period. I saw over 100 honeybees. I saw no vagans or fervidus, a few more carpenter bees, and now we start to see impatiens, which has a medium tongue and can't compete with these long-tongued species. So there was a complete shift in a single week. The honeybees were in large numbers and getting that nectar and not leaving anything for the fervidus and vagans, and they were back on the vetch and red clover. To put that in perspective, into more perspective, even with the common bumblebees, right? So here is mountain mint, the same site. 100 honeybees were observed on a bunch of mountain mint, only 12 common bumblebees, Bombus impatiens mostly, right? So it's a 10-to-1 ratio, and there were no at-risk bumblebees. And the same thing with goldenrod. Right? Goldenrod covered with honeybees and Bombus impatiens. Still, honeybees are outnumbering the common. So this is, these numbers are going up, still a 10-to-1 and no at-risk bumblebees. So again, there's clearly some pressure in terms of competition from honeybees. And here is an example of what that pressure can do, can move species off of a resource. Wild sumac, I saw honeybees do that as well. They pushed everything off collecting pollen from sumac. Okay, so, that's how we assess. We see what we have, what we don't have, and, we try to, seeing what we have also could involve not mowing. So in these larger areas, people like to mow. And what mowing does is it delays bloom or prevents bloom. So you really don't know what you have. And again, this happened at Breakneck Hill where they were mowing across the board. I noticed some willow. I said, let's leave the willow. The next year, the willow bloomed and it was covered with everything. The following year, there was even more. So I saw, the second year, I think I saw between 15 and 20 queens, where I didn't see a single queen on that site, 40 acres in previous years where there was no willow. Mowing around there was a little bit of wild rose that continually got mowed. We left it. It's now expanded. Same with bush honeysuckle and a lot of other natives. So just selective mowing, seeing what you have, labeling it and not mowing it and allowing those populations to grow might be all that you need to do to help these species at risk. The other thing that I want to say, before I shift into success stories is, cultivars. And when we talk about restoring habitats and putting these plants in, cultivars are not the same as the straight species. So here are some examples. Annie White worked on this. She gave a talk a couple of weeks ago in Rhode Island. I was able to catch that talk. So, if you saw her talk, this is a summary of her talk where, she looked at cultivars of a variety of different plant species and how many types of flower-visiting animals that she saw on the cultivars versus the straight species. So we're going to focus here, Echinacea. So here's Echinacea, the straight species, and here are some of the cultivars. And here are the results. So the purple bars corresponds to how many bees she observed on the straight species versus the cultivars. And you can see that here's bumblebees. You can see that many of these species are completely ignored by bumblebees. And so I've seen this many, many times in the field. I've been burned by nurseries telling me they're straight species, and I put them in the ground and I don't see anything on them. And I can test for nectar, which is typically why you don't see any activity on these cultivars. The problem with the cultivars is when you breed for one thing, like, so resources are limited. So if the plant is putting its resources into nectar production and you're telling the plant to put resources into flower display or flower color, it's got to pull resources from somewhere. And more often than not, it's pulling from nectar because nectar is linked to these other floral traits. And so you can get beautiful looking flowers that look exactly like the straight species, but don't produce nectar. And if they're not producing nectar, then they're not going to get anything visiting them and certainly not pollinating them. And so that's a problem. And so Annie did that. She looked at Lobelia cardinalis and a hybrid cultivar. And to me, they look very, very similar to one another, right? Looks like it's, hummingbirds should love this, right? But when you look at the nectar, here's the nectar for the straight species. Here's the nectar for the hybrid. Hummingbird's going to visit this and then completely ignore it. And not only is it going to ignore it, if it has the same floral traits, it's going to ignore all the straight species as well, because it's going to learn that there's no nectar. So why bother and go and visit something else? So this is a major problem with cultivars. Even if they did have enough nectar, the question is, did you change the chemistry, the leaf chemistry? Because if you did, then butterflies might not want to use it as a host plant, or you might change the taste of the seeds. And so birds aren't going to prefer to eat it. So there's a lot that you need to consider when you put cultivars in, and it's better to just go for straight species. All right, so to conclude then, I said I'd finish on a high note. So what I've done, COVID was a negative, had some positives. You have to look at the silver lining. One was that people had a lot of time on their hands and they were able to help me to put these plants in the ground. So taking plants from my list and putting them in the ground. So I established some sites at Dartmouth and Southborough, and I've got other sites going that went in last year and are going in this year. And what I want to point out here is, here's what we put in Southborough. And in the background, you can see the 40 acres. So I was surveying all of this, and it goes way over here to the side of the slide. But this is how much we put in, not a heck of a lot relative to what's out there. In Dartmouth, here's a strip, not very large strip. And we put in plants and plugs because, there was an increased chance that I would get what I want, because when you throw seeds down, you don't know which ones are going to take and which ones aren't. And you'll get some blooming the first year. And sure enough, when these things bloom the first year, these are all pictures of Fervidus and vagans, the two species, target species. These are low elevation areas, visiting plants in the habitats that I created. And again, Dartmouth, I'd see one or two Fervidus. They were in the area. I saw dozens. Here in Southborough, as I mentioned, I'd see them rarely. Some years I didn't see any. And there were multiple individuals observed in the habitat throughout the entire summer from bloom on. The following year, we started to see some other things bloom. So here's showy goldenrod, which is a major, it's all goldenrods are not the same. So this is a Bombus vagans queen on showy goldenrod. You don't see it on other goldenrods. And showy goldenrod must kick out a lot of nectar because it is covered with things, whereas other goldenrods in the area don't have as much diversity. Here's Bombus, Here is Bombus vagans on Penstemon hirsutus. I believe this is in Dartmouth. And here is the Bombus fervidus in the same, so you can see the bags. This is the same area. I'm seeing Bombus, this was Bombus vagans, this is Bombus fervidus. These are bags. So I have students doing pollination experiments to see how important both of these species at risk are as pollinators, and it turns out they are extremely important. We have the data are starting to come in now. So yeah, so we're seeing these successes. The other thing that I want to finish with, I think I have a picture. Yes, I'll get to that in a second. The other thing that I want to remind you of is that it's, I told you the whole life cycle. So in the case of bees, there are ground nesting bees that like a sandy soil. There's some stem nesting bees. And in the case of the bumblebees, Bombus fervidus likes to nest in tall grass. And so this is my habitat that I put in at Dartmouth Natural Resources Trust. This is the community garden. And because of COVID, they didn't mow this area. They'd mowed it every other year. They didn't mow, and what that did was create habitat for Bombus fervidus, and this is showing where a Bombus fervidus nest is located. I told them not to mow this year, and there were 2 Bombus fervidus nests observed in this area. And you can see that this isn't a very large area of tall grass. But when you mow, they're not going to use it. When you don't mow, what happens is that you'll get rodent nesting. They like to use abandoned rodent nests. They're going to form these surface nests in the case of voles. And these fervidus queens are looking for that, and they're using it as nest sites. And so, the point here is that you don't need to change 40 acres to make a difference. You can do a small area and help conservation help conservation efforts. Finish with, I mentioned that it's about the connections. This picture was taken a month ago. This is a white-throated sparrow that was observed in Southborough by Don Vesey. The bird was observed eating the seeds of a shrubby St. John's wort that we put in. Birds weren't observed on site before, so these white-throated sparrows like cover. And so the shrubby St. John's wort provides them with the cover that they need to feed on the seeds. And this is a species that's considered to be in decline in Massachusetts. And so here we put in our native plant. It's helping our native bees, and the pollination products are helping wildlife. Exactly what I was hoping would happen. So it's great when a plan comes together, as they say. Anyway, with that, I would like to thank all of the people and groups listed here, and there are, I'm sure, others that I haven't updated this list in a bit, and the list continues to grow. And I hope that, if you have time and you could help me out, become a beecologist and help out with these conservation efforts. I'm happy to take any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. I didn't realize how many gaps I had in my knowledge until I started listening to all of your dense information on each of these slides. I'm going to have to listen to it again.
Yes, I apologize for going over.
No,
it's, we said
we
2
got
hours.
We got started late, and I was thoroughly engaged. Did anyone have a question? If they'd like to unmute themselves, or if you'd like to pop it in the chat, whatever's easier for you.
Yeah, I have a question. You mentioned you eradicated the
Loosestrife.
loosestrife.
Yes.
And what returned? Did you do any planting, or did you just allow nature to return?
I allowed nature to return, and I also had planted. So I had planted at the same time that those mimulus came up. I had put some mimulus in the habitat. So I did both.
Okay.
The pictures that I showed you were from what was there naturally. That was being suppressed by the loosestrife. So I didn't plant anywhere in the wetland area. I didn't plant anything. Everything was in that small area I showed you at the end.
Okay, interesting.
And
Okay.
loosestrife is well known to suppress. So things are in the seed bank, and the loosestrife is keeping them down, which is why loosestrife is so abundant.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to eradicate non-natives, and then just to allow what has been suppressed to come forward, as opposed to just fully overhaul with putting plants in.
Yeah, I'm certain that for most conservation lands that have invasives, if you cut them back, a lot of what you would plant is already there. And it's not just Southborough. In Western Mass, they had major invasive problems, and they had to remove it to allow traffic through in a road. And if you just look down the road, it's just a sea of color, and it's all native plants that were suppressed, and then these walls of invasives. So, there's a lot that's there that just isn't given a chance because, they're competitively, they can't do their thing. They're being suppressed by the non-native.
Right.
Yeah, the invasives come out earlier and get going faster in the season.
Yeah, or they have chemicals that prevent germination. There are lots of things going on with those plants that allow them to get a foothold and dominate landscapes.
So we're starting to get questions about people who would like to shift from lawn to other types of land use on their private property. And
Yep.
I myself have stopped mowing a lot of areas of my property to see what comes back. But for people who either have a strong preference or may live in a group housing type of situation where they're dealing with a housing association and they would like a short growing type of uniform green appearance, I thought you said there might be a type of grass early in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, there are native grasses and sedges that you could, well, sedges more so, that you could use that are low growing. But I think people would still be concerned about ticks in that case if they really care about having a mowed lawn. So there are things. So the best thing is Prunella vulgaris for that, as a lawn replacement. If you want to do something, if you were to get Prunella vulgaris, lanceolata seeds, which is the native Prunella, and I've done this at my house. I bought seed and just threw it down, and in the first year, I had some of them blooming. And the good thing about Prunella is if you mow it, it will bloom and the plant will adapt to the height of the mower. So you'll be able to mow and you'll have things in bloom that are under the mow. And so that's a really good one. And it's a nice blue and it's a native. So and it's highly preferred by vegans and Firbitus will visit it as well if it's in the area. So that's I think one of the best ones.
Thank you.
Okay.
There's a question in the chat from David Fichter who says, what about carpenter bees? I have some living in my door and have protected them, but should I not protect them?
Yeah, carpenter bees are native and you could protect them. If you don't want them, I would say, when it's still freezing, like right before things start to thaw out, you could there's a spray you can get that would make it distasteful or they wouldn't like the smell. It would deter them from drilling holes if you didn't want them to do that. So you should do that in the spring. And if you don't want wasp nests or you don't want bee nests, the spring is when you should be active because that's when it's a single queen looking for a nest site. And if she starts, you can just remove the nest site and, the queen will go somewhere else. But yeah, carpenter bees are fine. They're a part of the system.
Well, and they're pretty docile too. They don't
Yeah,
tend to.
the males will buzz you because and you'll see them chasing other things around. So they're fairly aggressive, but yeah, it's not in terms of, you're more likely for them to bite you and it to cause pain than anything, the males in particular.
I'm not seeing any other questions. Does anyone else want to chime in? So if we were to try to direct students or groups of scouts, for example, or anyone who might be interested in participating in your citizen science, can you remind us of your web page again for that?
So I think the best thing to do is to email me. Here's my email.
Okay.
And just tell me that you have a group that's interested. I'm happy to give another talk or a workshop to teach you how to ID some of these things and to walk through and survey with you to see what you have and make some recommendations. So I give workshops through the summer, but I could give one if you had a group that was interested. I'm happy to give a workshop, and it would I would a lot of the things that I talked about today I would actually show you. So if we have an area that has a bunch of things in bloom, we can go and I'll show you how these differences that I'm talking about, and talk about pollination and what's the difference between a pollinator and a flower visitor, and we can see that in the field. So yeah, if you get a group
Okay.
together, I'm happy to run something like that.
Yeah, because we have a number of groups looking at putting in pollinator gardens who are interested in putting in native gardens with the purpose of attracting pollinators, but I don't know to what degree they understand the interconnectedness that you've displayed to us this evening. So,
Yeah, I mean, if they want to, help the conservation of some of these things, they can chat. And if their goal is, to get some things visiting flowers, then either way, I'm happy to help out however I can.
great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I see some thumbs up. I don't see anybody trying to unmute.
All right.
So I so appreciate Carolyn bringing you to our attention, and you for setting us up with this workshop so quickly and giving us your time. I will be sending out or providing a link to the recording of this presentation. And if anybody would like to put any other last comments in the chat, this is your chance. Aaron says, thank you so much. This was awesome and so informative.
Oh, you're
I
welcome.
agree.
Oh, I'd like to say that if you wanted to try the web app, and as I mentioned, we're going to be, we need people to try out the app for the butterfly function and using the iNaturalist interface. That'll be launched this spring. So if you wanted to give that a try and email me your thoughts, constructive, like any feedback, or just learn how to use the app to collect data and help the project, then just shoot me an email as well, or give that a try. And if you have any questions, just email me.
Okay, I think we could probably put that on the website after the plant sale, which is our distribution happens in April. And
yeah,
so,
excellent.
So the folks who buy our plants can be aware that they can watch their plants for bloom and for butterflies, and try to help out with that.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Have a great night. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.